The airplane shook violently as dark clouds swallowed the sky, turning the once bright horizon into a wall of rolling blackness that seemed almost alive, like a giant creature wrapping itself around the aircraft with deliberate, crushing force. Passengers who had moments earlier been calm, sipping drinks or flipping through magazines, now clutched the armrests with tense, trembling fingers as oxygen masks rattled slightly above their heads, ready to deploy if the turbulence worsened. The aisles vibrated so intensely that a few loose items, an empty paper cup, a child's dropped crayon, a flight attendant's pen, skidded helplessly from side to side. Alarms echoed through the cabin, sharp and metallic, slicing through the rising noise of panicked voices. People were shouting, praying, gasping, holding on to loved ones. A mother pressed her child tightly against her chest, whispering soothing words even though her own voice trembled with fear. A businessman who prided himself on never showing emotion wiped a thin line of sweat from his forehead, his normally steady breathing now rapid and uneven. The windows flickered with flashes of lightning, illuminating faces twisted with terror for only a fraction of a second before plunging them back into the gloomy, storm-darkened cabin. The air smelled faintly of spilled coffee, electrical heat, and fear. Up front, the cockpit was no less chaotic. The captain, a veteran of thousands of hours in the sky, lay slumped in his seat, his forehead grazed by a falling panel that had shaken loose when the plane first hit the worst part of the turbulence. His eyes were open but unfocused, stunned and disoriented, his breathing shallow. The co-pilot had tried to help him, calling his name over the roar of the storm, but another violent jolt made it clear that she could not afford to divide her attention. Panels flickered. Instruments blinked red warnings one after another. Screens displayed data that changed too fast to process. She reached for the controls with steady but forceful hands, her pulse pounding in her ears even as she forced herself to remain calm. The storm had swallowed them whole, and she had seconds, maybe less, to stabilize the aircraft. Outside the windshield, sheets of rain slammed against the glass like handfuls of gravel. The wipers, though working at full speed, seemed painfully slow compared to the sheer volume of water. Lightning crackled so close that for an instant it felt as if electricity was crawling across the nose of the aircraft. Back in the cabin, one of the flight attendants attempted to move down the aisle to reassure passengers, but the shaking was so intense that she had to brace herself against seatbacks, her knees buckling with each sudden drop. A teenage boy offered her his hand to steady her, and she gave him a grateful, terrified smile before continuing. A man in the last row pressed a button to call for assistance, believing his elderly mother might be fainting, but the sound of the chime was swallowed by the storm's thunder and the aircraft's alarms. The turbulence hit again, harder this time, causing overhead bins to rattle furiously. A few burst open, spilling bags that smacked loudly against seats and armrests, adding to the chaos. The aircraft lurched to the left, then to the right, as though caught in the jaws of a powerful unseen force determined to tear it apart. In the cockpit, the co-pilot's training replayed through her mind like a rapid sequence of memories, simulator sessions, emergency drills, instructors emphasizing that the sky was unpredictable and that true skill revealed itself not in calm air but in moments like this. But experiencing it firsthand, with real lives at stake and the captain incapacitated beside her, made every decision feel heavier, sharper, more immediate. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and yet her voice remained steady as she spoke into the radio, trying to contact air traffic control. Static crackled, drowning out whatever reply existed. She tried again. More static. The storm was interfering with the signal, blocking her connection to the outside world. She had never felt so isolated, stranded in the sky with a roaring storm above, below, and around her. The plane lurched downward suddenly, the sensation so abrupt that every passenger felt their stomach drop as though falling through empty space. Screams filled the air. A baby cried inconsolably. Someone shouted for God's help. Someone else cursed under their breath. The co-pilot tightened her grip, adjusting the nose angle with as much precision as she could manage while the aircraft bucked like a wild animal. She forced herself to breathe evenly, counting each inhale and exhale, grounding herself in the rhythm despite the chaos. She checked the captain again, still breathing, but barely conscious. She needed him, but she couldn't wake him now. Not while every second mattered. Not while the storm hurled the aircraft around like a toy. More lightning flashed, bright, blinding streaks that illuminated the swirling, monstrous clouds outside. The engines roared, their hum shifting unpredictably as if struggling against the violent winds tearing at them. Drops of rain streaked across the windows so fast that they turned into blurry lines, making it almost impossible to see beyond a few meters. The co-pilot mentally mapped everything she knew about storms: wind shear, updrafts, downdrafts, microburst. She imagined the invisible currents pushing and pulling the aircraft, trying to anticipate each threat before it struck. She reminded herself that she was trained for this. She had studied storms, had flown through rough weather before, but never like this. Not with the captain down. Not with 200+ lives depending solely on her. In the cabin, people braced for another impact. A man reached across the aisle to hold his wife's hand. A young girl covered her ears to block out the thunder. The flight attendant at the front struggled to make an announcement, her voice trembling as she spoke into the intercom, trying to reassure everyone that the situation was under control, even though she herself did not fully believe it. But her words, shaky as they were, offered some comfort. A few passengers closed their eyes, whispering prayers. A few focused on breathing. A few stared silently out the window, mesmerized by the furious dance of lightning. The plane shook again, this time with a jolt so violent that it knocked a food cart loose from the galley. It rolled forward, wheels clattering loudly, until it rammed into a row of seats and stopped. The sudden noise made several people flinch. The co-pilot felt the jolt too, her seat rattling so hard she thought it might detach from its base. She tightened her seatbelt further, feeling the restraint dig into her ribs. She glanced at the altitude reading, dropping too fast. She fought against it, adjusting throttle, adjusting angle, trying to coax the aircraft upward, urging it to climb or at least stabilize. Her muscles strained, her fingers aching from gripping the controls. Every sound, the alarms, the thunder, the wind, the shifting metal, pressed into her mind like a chorus of danger signals. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The storm showed no mercy, its wind swirling and spiraling around the aircraft. Rain slapped the fuselage with relentless force. The aircraft rocked and dipped and tilted, each movement more violent than the last. Yet she persisted. She refused to surrender to panic. She refused to let fear make her hesitate. Every decision she made, every adjustment of the controls, every breath she took, she performed with a clarity that surprised even herself. Her training, her discipline, her determination, they formed a shield around her mind, protecting her from the overwhelming fear that threatened to seep in. Then, through the thick chaos, she noticed a slight change. The lightning seemed a little more distant. The rain, though still heavy, no longer hammered at the windows with the same ferocity. The alarms softened as she corrected the aircraft's angle. The altitude began to steady, barely, but enough to give her a sliver of hope. She held onto that hope, feeding it, letting it guide her actions. She spoke into the intercom, telling the passengers to remain seated, her voice firm and steady despite her racing heart. The passengers heard her calm tone and clung to it, drawing strength from it. Slowly, their fear shifted into something like cautious faith. The storm continued to rumble, but the worst of its fury seemed to have passed. The clouds around them lightened, turning from deep black to a murky gray. The lightning now flashed farther away, illuminating the sky with brief, fading bursts. The aircraft, though still shuddering, no longer felt on the verge of falling apart. The co-pilot adjusted the throttle again, guiding the plane upward, inch by inch, until they pierced through the final layers of turbulence and rose into a calmer stretch of atmosphere. The sudden stillness felt unreal, almost eerie after the relentless chaos they had endured. Inside the cabin, the shift was immediate. People gasped in relief. Some began to cry softly. Others leaned back in their seats, exhausted from fear. A few whispered thank yous, their voices filled with gratitude and disbelief. The flight attendants checked on passengers as best they could, offering comfort, handing out water, making sure no one was injured. For a moment, the entire cabin felt united in shared survival, in the fragile, beautiful realization that they had made it through something terrifying together. The co-pilot finally allowed herself a slow breath. A real breath. A deep breath. She checked the captain again, still unconscious, but stable enough for the moment. She stabilized the aircraft and began making emergency plans for landing. But in the quiet that followed, she felt something powerful, a mix of exhaustion, gratitude, and the overwhelming truth that she had just prevented a tragedy. She had taken control in the storm, alone in the cockpit with the sky raging around her, and she had saved everyone on board. Amid the chaos, she, a calm, trained co-pilot, took the controls. Her hands moved with a steadiness that seemed almost impossible given the violent shaking of the aircraft around her, but she had trained for moments exactly like this, where the line between disaster and survival was drawn by nerves of steel and the ability to think clearly while the world demanded panic. She leaned slightly forward in her seat, tightening her grip as the storm's roar surrounded the plane like an angry ocean swallowing a lone ship. The cabin lights flickered, then steadied, then flickered again. Thunder cracked outside in deafening bursts, the lightning bright enough to illuminate the cockpit with ghost-like flashes. But she kept her eyes locked on the instruments, refusing to let the chaos scatter her focus. Her pulse raced, but her breathing stayed controlled, each inhale deliberate, each exhale grounding. Behind the sealed cockpit doors, passengers cried, shouted, and prayed, the echoes of their fear carrying faintly through the metal barrier. She heard the muffled panic but did not allow it to enter her mind. She pressed the intercom button, her voice cutting through the alarm bells with calm authority as she instructed everyone to fasten their seatbelts and trust her. There was something almost miraculous in the way her tone softened the terror in the cabin. Even though they were strangers, even though she could not see their faces, her words carried a strength that reached them. Passengers who moments ago were gripping seats with white-knuckled desperation felt a flicker of hope, a thread of reassurance that someone trained, someone brave, was in control. The storm roared like a living beast, shaking the aircraft with unpredictable bursts of turbulence. Sheets of rain slammed against the windshield, distorting visibility until it felt like flying inside a waterfall. The wind howled, twisting around the fuselage with fierce determination, as though trying to rip the plane from her control. But she did not panic. She steadied the plane with micro-adjustments, subtle shifts that came not from instinct alone but from years of studying weather patterns, emergency drills, simulations that replicated extreme conditions, and the pressure of countless practice scenarios designed to prepare her mind for exactly this level of intensity. Her training rose inside her like a shield, protecting her from the fear that would have paralyzed someone less prepared. She glanced quickly to her left where the captain sat slumped, still unconscious. A thin line of dried blood marked his temple. She checked his breathing, shallow but steady, before turning her full attention back to the storm. Every second counted now, every movement of her hands either fought the storm or surrendered to it, and surrender was not an option. She felt the full weight of responsibility press against her chest, but instead of fear, it filled her with clarity. 200 lives depended on her decisions. Every passenger, every child, every parent, every stranger sitting in those seats, was counting on her, even if they never knew her name. The plane lurched violently upward as a gust of wind hit from below. The sudden jolt sent a surge of adrenaline through her body, but she forced herself not to stiffen. Instead, she softened her grip just enough to feel the plane's movement as an extension of her own reflexes. She guided the nose down slightly, not too much, just enough to counter the force. Another blast of turbulence struck, but she stayed ahead of it, anticipation sharpening her senses. Her mind worked rapidly, calculating angles, adjusting pitch, monitoring altitude, balancing airspeed, cross-checking instruments that flashed conflicting warnings. She tried once more to contact air traffic control, but only static crackled through the speakers. She repeated the call, louder, clearer, but still nothing. The storm was interfering with the signal. They were flying blind, disconnected from the world below. Yet she did not let this isolation shake her resolve. If anything, it hardened it. She had always known that there might come a day when she would have to rely solely on her training and instincts. That day had come. In the cabin, passengers felt a sudden shift as the plane steadied, moving from erratic plunges to a more controlled, deliberate path. They didn't know what she was doing at the front of the aircraft, but they could feel her influence through every correction, every smooth reclaiming of balance after each violent jolt. A mother wiped tears from her cheeks as she hugged her toddler close. A man who had been gripping his armrest like a lifeline slowly loosened his hold, his fingers trembling but no longer frozen in terror. A teenager whispered, "She's got this," to no one in particular, and others nodded, even though they couldn't hear him. Hope was a small flame, but it grew inside the cabin, fed by her steady voice and the subtle way the aircraft began to obey her. She continued speaking to them between adjustments, short, clear instructions, delivered with unwavering stability. "Keep your seatbelts fastened. Remain calm. I am in control of the aircraft." She avoided technical terms, avoided anything that could sound like uncertainty. Her voice was the anchor they desperately needed, a rope connecting them to safety amid the storm's brutal chaos. And though she could not see their faces, she imagined them listening, imagined her words reaching out like a hand in the darkness, pulling them toward reassurance. Another strike of lightning lit up the sky, lighting everything outside like a stuttering strobe. For a split second, the swirling clouds became visible, massive, churning pillars that rose like mountains taller than any on Earth. She felt the force of the storm's energy, felt the power of the natural world pressing against the machine she commanded. But she did not flinch. Her concentration sharpened even further. She watched the instrument panel, read the fluctuations, predicted the storm's next move. Every moment seemed stretched, slowed, as though time itself understood the gravity of the situation and gave her the space she needed to act. The plane dipped sharply again. Gasps echoed through the cabin. Baggage inside overhead compartments shifted like restless animals trying to escape. She lowered the nose just enough to ride the drop rather than fight it. Fighting made turbulence worse. She remembered her instructors repeating that advice over and over: do not fight a storm. Guide the plane through it. Respect its strength. Use its momentum. She did exactly that, letting the aircraft move with the downdraft for a breath before reclaiming control. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her grip remained precise. The storm pressed harder on the aircraft, the turbulence becoming so fierce that even her seatbelt dug painfully against her hips. She braced, but her mind remained untouched by the panic that gripped the cabin. She acted with purpose. She adjusted flaps, shifted throttle settings, rebalanced the aircraft's trajectory. She closed her eyes for half a second, grounding herself in her breath, reminding herself that she was capable, trained, prepared. When she opened her eyes again, they were sharper, her determination stronger. The storm grew louder, angrier, as though resenting her refusal to bow to it. Winds battered the wings from alternating directions. The plane shook as if trapped inside a giant hand intent on crushing it. The sensors beeped frantically, signaling shifts in air pressure and potential hazards. But she kept going. Her body felt like it was vibrating in sync with the aircraft, every nerve tuned to its movements. She listened to the sound of the engines, felt the push of the air currents, noticed even the smallest change in vibration. She became one with the machine, connected to it in a way that transcended fear. She finally saw a slight thinning in the density of the clouds ahead, not a break in the storm, but a subtle shift that her trained eyes recognized as a path. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough. She nudged the controls gently, guiding the aircraft toward that possible opening. The storm didn't want to let them go, hammering harder, as if sensing their attempt to escape. Thunder boomed so loudly that it rattled the cockpit panels. But she remained unshaken. A violent gust shoved the plane sideways. The cabin let out a chorus of yells. Even the cockpit jolted hard enough to slam her shoulder against the seat. Her breath caught, but she forced her mind back into focus instantly. She corrected the tilt, carefully, not with panic but with deliberate skill. She spoke again into the intercom, her voice still calm despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "I am here. Stay with me. We're going to be all right." And something about the way she said it made people believe her. The storm continued its assault, but the plane persisted. She guided it toward the thinning patch of cloud with the quiet stubbornness of someone who refused to lose. The opening grew wider, still dangerous but offering the faintest hope of smoother air. The closer the aircraft moved toward it, the harder the storm pushed, as though trying to drag them back into its core. But she held her line. Sweat trickled down her temple, but her eyes never left the instruments. Then, slowly, the pressure changed. The growl of the storm softened. The shaking continued, but less violently, less chaotically. The rain thinned into streaks instead of walls. The lightning flashed farther away. And then the plane burst through the final layer of the storm into calmer air. The sudden quiet felt unreal. Like stepping out of a nightmare and into a dream. She allowed herself one long breath, a breath filled with relief, gratitude, and the dawning realization that she had done what many pilots never faced and few survived. She had taken control amid the storm, alone in the cockpit with no guidance, no communication, no help from the captain. She had been the single barrier standing between the passengers and disaster, and she had not faltered. Behind her, through the cabin door, she heard the unmistakable sound of applause, unplanned, emotional, grateful. Passengers were crying, hugging each other, thanking God, thanking fate, thanking her. She didn't turn around, she didn't need to. She simply wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, steadied her breathing, and began preparing for the next steps, because she knew her job wasn't finished yet. But for now, even with a long journey still ahead, she knew one truth with absolute clarity. She had not panicked. She had saved them. Flashed, the engines rattled, and the aircraft dipped dangerously, the sudden drop creating a stomach-turning sensation that made several passengers scream as overhead bins quivered violently above their heads. The entire plane felt as if it had been caught in an invisible fist, shaken mercilessly by the storm's furious grip. The cockpit lit up in bright, blinding white for an instant as another bolt cracked across the sky, illuminating the swirling chaos of clouds outside. The co-pilot's heartbeat surged, but her hands remained steady on the controls. Every muscle in her arms tensed as she fought against the powerful drafts that seemed determined to drag the plane downward. The aircraft shuddered again, violently, the vibrations rattling through the control column like an electrical current buzzing up her arms. She didn't allow the shock to interrupt her focus for even a millisecond. Her instincts, honed by years of training, countless simulations, emergency drills, and long hours in the sky, rose to the surface with razor-sharp clarity. With a split-second decision that would determine the fate of every soul on board, she adjusted the plane's angle, tilting it just enough to counteract the downward pull of the storm. There was no time to hesitate, no time to doubt, no time to second-guess. Adrenaline sharpened her senses until she felt she could hear everything, the hum of the struggling engines, the slamming of rain against the windshield, the subtle pitch of the wind slashing past the fuselage. She pushed through the turbulence with precise skill, applying exactly the right amount of force, not too much, not too little. A wrong move could stall the aircraft or send it spiraling, a delay could cost them precious altitude. But she acted with the composure of someone born for this moment. The plane dipped again, violent and unpredictable, as a gust of wind slammed into the left wing. She steadied it immediately, her reflexes faster than her fear. Her mind worked faster still, calculating angles, airspeed, drift, and the shifting weight of the plane as turbulence tossed it around like a leaf in a storm. Her breath came steady and deep, a practiced rhythm that kept panic from rising. She was aware of her pulse thudding in her neck, aware of her palms damp with sweat, but none of that shook her. She had been trained for crisis, trained to think clearly when the world narrowed to a few flashing instruments and a deafening storm battering metal wings. She shifted her gaze rapidly between the altimeter, the attitude indicator, and the artificial horizon, her brain taking in all the information instantly, translating it into action. The aircraft bucked again, but she anticipated it, nudging the controls at exactly the right moment. The co-pilot could almost feel the storm's patterns, the invisible currents streaming around them. She sensed where the pressure shifted, where the wind carved through the clouds in unpredictable spirals. Her years of flying had trained her to feel these things, subtle cues that existed beyond the instrument readings, the kind of intuition only a pilot who had spent thousands of hours in the sky could understand. Behind her, she could hear faint echoes of chaos from the cabin. Though the cockpit door was shut, the sharp cries of terrified passengers filtered through the steel barrier whenever the plane jolted. She imagined people gripping seats, holding loved ones, closing their eyes as the aircraft tilted sharply again. A small child was probably crying somewhere. Someone might be praying softly. Someone else might be whispering apologies or desperately clutching the hand of a stranger. She could picture it all because she had seen it before, not this storm, not this severity, but moments of panic. Moments when passengers realized how fragile flight could feel when nature turned violent. But she couldn't focus on that. She didn't allow emotion to disrupt the sharp line of logic guiding her movements. Right now she was the only barrier between chaos and catastrophe. Fear was a luxury she didn't have time for. Lightning cracked again, this time so close that the cockpit lit up as if a camera had gone off inches from her face. Thunder followed instantly, a deep, booming roar that vibrated through the panels, giving her the unsettling sense that the sky itself was shaking apart. But her discipline held her firm. She kept her focus locked on the controls. Another burst of turbulence hit, and for a split second the aircraft tilted so sharply that even she felt her stomach lift. But her hands corrected the tilt, countering the force with the smoothness of a seasoned aviator. To an untrained eye, her movements might have looked effortless, small, precise corrections, but inside her mind, thousands of thoughts collided in rapid succession. Altitude, dropping, correct it now. Speed, steady, keep it steady. Pitch, adjust slightly. Wind shear, brace for it. Engines, listen to their rhythm. Radar, keep scanning for clearer air. Her brain processed it all with incredible speed. Yet her body moved calmly, almost gracefully, like a dancer adjusting to the shifting rhythm of a violent orchestra. The engines rattled again, harder this time. The sound was deeper, more ominous, like metal grinding under pressure. She felt the vibration through her seat, through the pedal beneath her foot. She instinctively reduced thrust just a fraction to stabilize equilibrium, then increased it again to compensate for altitude loss. It was a dangerous balance. Too much thrust could strain the engines, too little could let the aircraft fall into a dangerous descent. She calibrated everything with the precision of a surgeon performing an operation in the midst of an earthquake. The storm outside roared with relentless fury. Rain pounded the glass so thickly that it looked as if the plane was submerged underwater. The wipers swiped back and forth at maximum speed, but even they seemed too slow, overwhelmed by the sheets of water slamming against the cockpit. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, branching like electric veins through the darkness. For a fraction of a second, she saw the terrifying magnitude of the storm, the towering columns of swirling clouds, the violent updrafts forming spirals that could swallow a plane whole if approached at the wrong angle. She resisted the instinct to stare longer, immediately dragging her focus back to the instruments. Looking outside during a storm this fierce could be disorienting, even dangerous. Her training whispered through her mind in the voice of old instructors, trust your instruments. Trust your instincts. Trust your training. She did. She had to. The aircraft trembled once more, jerking to the right in a sharp twist that sent her body lurching against her harness. Her seatbelt tightened against her chest, pressing painfully into her ribs, but she ignored the discomfort. Her eyes darted to the horizon indicator. Without hesitation, she corrected the roll. The yoke pushed back against her hands with stubborn resistance, almost as if the storm itself were fighting for dominance, but she held firm, guiding the plane with a strength that came not from physical power but from absolute mental command. In those moments, time felt distorted. Each second seemed to stretch, filled with split-second decisions and hyper-awareness. She could feel her senses sharpening, her hearing tuning into the pitch of the engines, her vision zeroing in on the instrument cluster, her awareness expanding to the full rhythm of the aircraft. The ringing alarms no longer sounded chaotic, they sounded informational. The shaking did not feel like danger, it felt like a coded message from the sky, something she needed to interpret and respond to with precision. The fear inside her did not vanish, but it transformed into something useful, fuel for her focus, a reminder of what was at stake. As the plane fought through another violent updraft, she pushed forward gently, adjusting the angle once more. The aircraft obeyed her, slowly at first, reluctantly, but then more steadily. The nose lifted just enough to counter the downdraft ahead. The wings cut through the turbulent air, slicing between pockets of pressure that tried to force them into spirals. For a moment the vibration decreased, not gone, but reduced. She felt the shift instantly, a faint lightening of the pressure that tightened the muscles in her neck. She seized the moment, correcting trajectory, nudging the aircraft toward a slightly more stable corridor within the storm. She felt sweat dripping down the back of her neck, felt it gather on her brow, but she didn't wipe it away. She kept both hands on the controls, knowing that even a half-second of distraction could undo everything she'd managed to stabilize. The storm wasn't finished, not even close. She felt it building behind the aircraft, felt the unpredictable pressure of wind currents chasing them, felt the electrical tension in the air that always signaled more turbulence. The clouds outside flashed again, bright and blinding. The engines rumbled, strained, but steady. Her eyes flicked to every screen, every dial, every gauge. She adjusted again, and again, and again. Each movement was a battle. Each adjustment was a rescue. No one in the cabin could see her face. No one could understand the sheer mental weight resting on her shoulders. But she remained the unshakable force holding the aircraft on course, guiding it through chaos with a determination so fierce it seemed to radiate through her fingertips. The storm pushed, and she pushed back. The wind roared, and she refused to let it win. Lightning flashed, thunder boomed, and still she remained steady, her mind locked in perfect synchrony with the machine she commanded. She did not panic. She did not falter. She did not lose control. She brought the aircraft back from the edge because she refused to let fear make a single decision for her. And high above the world, where darkness swallowed the sky and the storm tried to claim everything in its path, she held on with unbreakable resolve, fighting wind, gravity, lightning, and fate itself with nothing more than skill, courage, and a split-second decision that saved lives.
Moments later, the sky began to clear, slowly revealing soft patches of blue behind the fading storm clouds. The violent shaking eased, the engine steadied, and a calm silence spread through the cabin as if the entire aircraft had taken a collective breath. Passengers who had been gripping their seats with fear now wiped their tears, realizing they were safe. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others hugged the person beside them, overwhelmed by the relief of surviving what felt like the longest moments of their lives. In the cockpit, she finally allowed herself a quiet exhale, her hands still steady on the controls, her focus unbroken even after the worst had passed. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't let fear take root, she had remained calm, deliberate, and precise when the sky itself seemed to be falling apart. She didn't think of herself as a hero, yet every soul on that aircraft knew the truth. In those moments of terror, when the storm was at its fiercest and hope seemed thin, it was her courage, steady and fearless, that kept them alive. She had saved 228 lives not with noise or dramatic gestures, but with unwavering skill, quiet strength, and a heart brave enough